Okay, hello. We're back. Um, this is CSC230 from Manchester Community College, and we're working through Murach's MySQL book, and we're on page 216, and how to work with data types. We've already seen string, integer, and date data types. And as we get more involved with looking at creating our own columns and understanding the type of data we're going to be storing, our knowledge for data types will increase. One of the things that happens when we store data in a database is what we have to do is convert the data from the type of data that it's stored as to the type of data that is needed for the final output. For instance, a date value is not really stored as the year, month, and date. It's actually stored as a numeric value hidden within the system, and that can be different depending upon the operating system and different things like that, the software and all sorts of stuff. A string value and a numeric value are really two different things. The string value, number one, may or may not be the numeric value, number one. Now, what we're going to learn about in Chapter 8 is dealing with converting one data type to another data type, so that as data is stored one way, has an integer, has a float, has a date, we might need it another way. So what you need to do is, this is really a read chapter. There aren't a lot of SQL statements to be issuing. So what to do is read up until I think it looks like page 232. So 216 to 232, read those pages through and get a good handle on the foundation that's listed in the chapter. And then come back to the video and jump in at page 232, and we'll issue some commands. And there's only a few commands to issue to see this in practice. So I'm going to pause and go ahead and everybody read pages 216 to 232 and then come back. Okay, you can see up here I have up on the screen the select statements that are on page 233. We're going to use the AP database, and we're going to select and look at the invoice total field, and we're going to concatenate the $ to the invoice total field from invoices. Before we do that, let's describe the invoices table. Let's look at that for a minute. And notice that the invoice total field is a decimal. So by default, it's a decimal. So I'm going to just shut off this concatenate, and I'm going to run this. Oh, I need to get rid of that comma. Okay, I'm going to run this, and we see this is the invoice total is a decimal value. Now, if I was to actually, what happens here is this concatenate function says put the $ before invoice total. So now I'm going to see the invoice total has a integer, has a numeric, and I'm going to see it with a $. And the truth of the matter is, at this point, it's actually implicitly, just automatically, been turned into a string. So, for example, I want to put the invoice total here twice, and I'm going to say I want to concatenate plus Paul and see what happens. Okay, what happened here was it didn't like that, and it's not adding it or concatenating. Is it a period sign? No, it doesn't like that. It's just not, matter of fact, it's calling the column plus Paul, which is kind of funny. What happened here is the concatenate function actually put the string on. That now if I was to go plus Paul, I do believe, no, it still isn't like that. Hang on a second. So I tried a couple of things, and when you use a concatenated operator like this, plus stuff, it just doesn't like it at all. And you can see that the end result was 0. But when you use the concatenate function, that it will concatenate it. Matter of fact, I could probably put this here, and you can see how it concatenated that whole string there. Now also here we have a situation where we're going to take the invoice number, which happens to be string. If we actually describe and we look at the invoice number, that's a varchar, 50 characters long. And when we look at this data, you'll see that this is not doing the math with the dashes. This has a divide sign. There's letters here and hyphens in there. So this invoice number is string data. And then when you implicitly did some math to the invoice number by taking the invoice number and putting it into this value, you just got all sorts of weird stuff there. And then the last one it gives is the invoice date, which is a date field. And notice here it's showing has a string, outputting that by default as a string, but it really is a internal date. And then here it actually converted this to an integer and added 1 to it. If I was to say, add 2 to it, then now it added 8. Now that's 10, 10, that's 12, and 15. So you have to be really careful when you concatenate two types of data types together and that they're not the same. Now, what you have to do to make it work is you have to cast it, or you have to wrap it in a function that basically says, turn this data type into the data types that I want to work with. So let's move on now to page 234 and 235. And you'll read about cast and convert. And they're two basic flavors of the same statement. And the convert function is not used as much, according to the book, as the cast function is. Okay, so now on page 234 and 235, and on 235 are the examples. We're still using the AP database. We're going to run the cast function, and what this will do is going to convert the invoice date into a varchar, or a character. Going to cast the invoice total has signed, which actually basically in this case means take a float, which has 2 decimal points, and turn it into a integer, get rid of the decimal points. And here is the exact same statement, but instead of using the cast function, it uses the convert, and we'll get the same results. There it is. Notice 3813, 40, 130, and now I'm going to run the convert version, 3813, 40, 139. Yeah, so the results are the same. So it's basically 2 different ways to do the same thing. And there will be times that you'll want to do operations to 2 different columns, but because one data type is different than the other data type, you have to cast it or convert it. Okay, so the book now on page 236, 237 talks about the format and the char character. And what's interesting here is you can see this char 1310, char 1310. That's basically going to put in a line feed and a carriage return, but it'll only work on a printer. So when we run this, it actually is putting it all in the same value. But if this was being sent to a printer, it would actually give a line feed and a carriage return for that. There is no example in the book on the format, but let me come up with one real quick. Okay, the book doesn't give us an example of the format function, but here I have the invoice total. I'm using the format function to the invoice total with 0 decimal places, and the format function with the invoice total and I want to see 4 decimal places. So if I execute that, you'll see here's the invoice total by default, which is the float 2, and then here it is with no decimal places, and here it is with 4 decimal places. Okay, so chapter 8 was pretty easy. A little bit of reading, less to do work in the actual lesson, and quite honestly, the homework assignment is only come up with a couple of select statements, so it shouldn't be that hard. What this has done is introduced you to working with data types and differing data types. When we get now into chapter 9, we're going to get into string functions, and I think maybe date functions, and you do a lot of that stuff in the real world. So you'll start to see a lot of ways that we can manipulate data. I had a page up here. Where was it? Let's see. MySQL functions. Yeah, so if you were to Google MySQL functions, hang on a second, I got to flip back to the screen. If you Google MySQL functions, you'll get to the reference manual. And in the reference manual, you'll see tons of functions that are out there. And for instance, string functions, we're going to be getting into and listing a lot of these. And there's information on all of these string functions. And if you take a look, there's operators, numeric functions, time and date functions, a lot of stuff in converting time and date values in a database. Say if you want the day of the week. So let's just even kind of let me come up with an interesting version of this real quick, just for a date function. Okay, so I just randomly picked day name, and if we scroll down here, you see month name. And then I took our invoices table, and the invoice date, there it is by default, and now here it is wrapped with the month name and the day name, and I executed that, and you can see the invoice date, there's the month, and there's the day name. Here's May, June, July. So you can see that there are lots of functions. You need to understand what type of data type a given column is, and then you find the right function to cast it and convert it to what you need to do. Okay, so that's the last of chapter 8. Looks like we knocked this one down in less than 15 minutes, which is great, and we'll move on to chapter 9.